go to the other side. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For nearly 20 years in this chamber, I know I've heard time and again Republicans claim that they backed the blue. Just recently, Chairman Jordan put out a press release around the Law Enforcement Appreciation Day resolution, which said when it comes to supporting the police, quote, Republicans put words into action, unquote. Yet when it comes to walking that walk, Republicans too often take a seat. Just yesterday, we took a vote on a bipartisan spending bill that includes funding for our criminal justice programs. Of the Republicans that make up this committee, a handful of you voted against it. That, of course, would mean less funding for state and local law enforcement agencies and more criminals on our streets and in our neighborhoods. That no vote means no funding for the Internet Crimes Against Children program, a key law enforcement tool that keeps online predators away from our children. Those actions sure don't back the blue, and now today, Republicans want to target law enforcement yet again. This time, they purposefully downplay the heinous violence that injured and traumatized hundreds of Capitol Police officers in the January 6th insurrection, perhaps the most infamous assault on law enforcement in recent American history. Specifically, our Republican colleagues are taking aim at the ability to use financial records as a tool to prosecute the coup plotters, the criminals who attempted to stop the legitimate constitutional transfer of power in Congress. These are the very financial tools that help hold to account the people who tried to overthrow a presidential election. Officer Fanone, thank you so much for repeatedly testifying about your experiences. I'm sure it isn't easy, as you mentioned, to relive these traumatic moments. Could you describe some of the violence briefly that Capitol Police officers were subjected to on January 6th?
Certainly. So I, like many other officers from the Metropolitan Police Department, self-deployed that day in that I heard distress calls coming out from officers who were already deployed at the Capitol complex and took it upon myself to respond to those calls for assistance. When I arrived at the Capitol, I made my way to what's referred to as the Lower West Terrace Tunnel in response to a specific distress call coming from officers that were defending that tunnel against a large group of violent rioters that were trying to gain access.
Thank you.
When I entered the tunnel, I observed about 40 or 50 DC police officers and a few U.S. Capitol Police officers attempting to hold back the violent mob. The officers were being assaulted with a variety of different weapons, everything from metal poles, 2x4s, aluminum baseball bats, batons, and other police equipment that had been stripped from police officers themselves were then used against officers.
Thank you, Officer Fanone. Thank you. I'm sorry, I want to just make sure I can get some other items in. The video that we saw earlier was disturbing. In a video that I don't have time to show, you can hear words like traitor being yelled at police officers and shouts like F the blue. 5 police officers who served at the Capitol died in the aftermath of the insurrection. Officer Fanone, what's your response to those who say that no police officers were killed by the events on January 6, 2021?
Well, my thoughts on Officer Brian Sicknick. Obviously, Brian Sicknick's cause of death was ruled unrelated to the Capitol riot. That being said, I think that good, decent people would understand that if it were not for his participation in the defense of this Capitol on January 6th against a violent mob, Brian Sicknick would be here with us today. I understand, I think better than most, the post-traumatic stress that accompanied my participation in defending the Capitol on January 6th, and then enduring the mischaracterization or lies about what I experienced that day from people in positions of power, many of whom were here at the Capitol themselves. I understand what brought many officers to taking their own lives. And I certainly attribute their actions to their participation in defense of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and my Republican colleagues, once again, I ask that you stop trivializing the violent assault the entire world saw that day, both to our democracy and to our law enforcement. And please do not cavalierly discard financial information as a law enforcement tool to prevent the next January 6th. The necessity of making this tool for law enforcement is even more imperative considering the presidential candidate you support all but promises yet another assault, violent or otherwise, on our sacred democracy. And I yield back.
Gentlelady
Mr.
yields
Chairman,
back.
before you go to the next member, if I can ask again for a unanimous consent request.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the FBI's situation report sent to financial institutions on January 13, 2021, which explains in the middle of page 2 the exact kind of threats that the FBI was trying to prevent leading up to the inauguration that day. These were threats to murder members of Congress and start a shooting at the inauguration, the exact type of threats the FBI is responsible for investigating. And I quote, "On 8 January, information was received regarding a video posted on an identified website encouraging people to kill senators and Congress members. The poster of the video was identified via social media exploitation. The video was threatening violence in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day and advised people to bring guns."
Without objection. We want the FBI to do their job. We just want them to do it in a way consistent with the Constitution. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Knight, thank you for your testimony today. In 2022, gun ban activists, amalgamated bank, and far-left politicians pushed for the creation of an unconstitutional merchant category code to be assigned to firearms retailers to identify, quote, suspect purchases and report purchasing patterns to law enforcement, a clear unconstitutional infringement on Second Amendment rights, and a clear backdoor to a gun registry. In fact, failed New York Attorney General Tish James specifically mentioned the importance of labeling gun and ammunition sales as a way to indicate an imminent crime. Since then, some states have banned the code, while states like California have mandated it to surveil Americans' purchases. This is why I introduced the Protecting Privacy in Purchases Act with Congressman Barr and Hudson to put a stop to this code and protect law-abiding Americans from this infringing unconstitutional overreach. Can you explain how does this code threaten Americans' privacy and constitutional rights?
Thank you very much. This code, and if we were to do similar codes for other sensitive issues, risks creating a raft of false positives where individuals who are potentially engaging in Second Amendment activity, because it's important to know that the MCC doesn't tell you what people buy, it just tells you where they buy it, right? Will be reported to the government as potentially suspicious for no real basis, or at least not a basis that is likely to be reasonable. And that's going to create a database that is available that could be searched later. One of the dangerous things about this financial database is that, or these financial records, is that they're retrospective. And even perhaps just as bad is that there's precious little reason to believe it would be effective at its stated goal for a host of reasons I can get into if you want.
Yes, please expand.
Okay, so the problem here is that you won't know what someone buys. You're expecting banks to correctly identify what is really a hallmark of violence. You're expecting them to report it promptly. You're expecting law enforcement to then act on it promptly and effectively. And so I'd like to point to, I don't know if they'd like me pointing to it, but Guns Down America has a report that advocates the MCC, but if you look at the examples they point to as possible examples where this could have helped, it's hard to believe they would, either because there's such a short time frame, 12 days. There's a reason to believe, I don't see why we believe that 12 days would be enough time for law enforcement to act on it, because we don't know how fast it takes the government to use any SARS. Or it's hard to actually differentiate suspicious activity from legitimate activity. Rather, they look at cases and then work backwards. So we don't know what the denominator is. We don't know how many false positives there will be. Also, in the recent report, when we look at the key bank methodology, it's very, very broad. It's very over-inclusive. And its thresholds are such that it's far more than you need to spend to commit a horrible act of violence, but less than you'd spend to get a good hunting rifle and scope. And so how how confident should we be that we're going to actually get more noise than, or signal than noise? I don't believe we should be. Given how little we know about how SARs are treated as is, I think we should be deeply skeptical.
And do you believe this is a backdoor to a gun registry?
I believe I believe some of its supporters view it as a backdoor to discourage firearms purchases.
Well, in my district in upstate New York, and Americans across this country are proud to stand up for our constitutional rights and understand this is an infringement on our constitutional rights. Why is my bill so important?
What's his point?
Well, ma'am, I think that efforts to restrict the collection of data at the bank level are the best option we have currently, because under current law, unless we can reform the BSA, once the bank has that data, government has that data. So preventing the collection at the bank level is your first best option.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield my time to the ranking member, but I just wanted to say to Officer Fanone, I was on the House floor on January 6th. We haven't had a chance to talk, but I know you have kids. My wife was at home with our son Jordan, who wasn't yet 2. She was 7 months pregnant. And, you know, thanks to your bravery, the bravery of your colleagues, and of true patriots who defended this Capitol, I believe I got to meet my son Cameron. So I want to thank you for your service. Thank you for your bravery. I'm sorry that you've had to endure so much of this personal attacks to try and undermine what you actually did that day. But I want you to know that people all across this country know what you did, respect you, and appreciate your service. So thank you. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allred. I believe we all share those sentiments. I want to say that this is not a partisan issue. I heard it said that January 6th is a partisan issue. I just want to read something. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. But the president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily as the chaos unfolded. He kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Even after it was clear to any reasonable observer that Vice President Pence was in danger, even as the mob carrying Trump banners were beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his vice president. Predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the mob seems to interpret this as a further inspiration to lawlessness and violence. That was the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. This is not partisan. And the reason we kept saying this is about January 6th is because it is about January 6th. They're trying to expand the scope of what the FBI was trying to do. It was not to invade all Americans' bank records. It was not about a violation of the Fourth Amendment against search and seizure. I've been a practitioner of the law, not just a law professor, not just someone with a graduate degree from law school, but a prosecutor, an investigator, and you use the tools that you have to prevent crimes from happening. Because guess what? I've shopped in a Bass Pro Shop plenty of times. I read the Bible on a regular basis. I happen to be in my family, happen to be gun owners. But I'm not afraid that the FBI is going to be searching my account because I was also not a rioter on January 6th. And I did not purchase a gun in the last 6 months before the inauguration and make plans to come back to attempt to again stop the free and fair election
of our government. It's getting ridiculous. Officer Fanone, so sorry. Officer Fanone, you saw the violence on January 6, 2021, and you saw the individuals. You were up close and way too personal with many of them. You also, unlike many of the people here, attended hearings, trials, and sentencing of many of those individuals. Based upon the knowledge that you have, that many of us here on this dais do not, do you know what ideology the January 6 rioters embraced? And how do you, if you do, how do you know that?
I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't speak to every single individual that was there that day at the Capitol. I didn't have an opportunity to interview them. I was too busy fighting for my life. That being said, I was present at a number of the sentencing hearings regarding individuals that were specifically charged with and later pled guilty to violent assaults of myself and other officers. And many of those individuals, in their plead for leniency to the judge at sentencing, cited the fact that they had been inspired by and by rhetoric used by the former president, by misinformation from news media outlets that led them to believe that the 2020 election had been stolen and that it was their patriotic duty to, in fact, respond to the Capitol that day and fight to save their country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
We began this hearing by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I'd like to begin my questioning by reciting the Fourth Amendment, because I think the other side of the aisles kind of forgot some of the terms that are in there. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is in our Constitution. Mr. Michel, can you tell us how the Bank Secrecy Act and exemptions to the Right to Financial Privacy Act may not be in compliance with the Fourth Amendment, or how the implementation of those acts may violate the Fourth Amendment?
Sure. Much like Brian Knight alluded to a minute ago, once the bank or a financial institution has the information, the government has it. So this came up in the early Supreme Court, or in the early court challenges. It came up in the Supreme Court cases that eventually, those cases eventually went to the Supreme Court, in that you have we effectively have a law that is a blank check for the federal government or for law enforcement to obtain all of your information simply without a warrant. So
Without probable cause?
they do not have to get a warrant. They do not have to show probable cause to get the warrant.
They have to give an oath or affirmation
No,
to a judge?
no, no. They have to go to the bank.
Yeah, so it seems to me that these acts, they're not just out of date, but they're outside of the Constitution. Mr. Knight, you began your opening statement by characterizing some of the things that the government could know or infer about you based on how you spend your money. Could you elaborate on that or reiterate? What are the things that government can know or infer based on purchasing habits?
Government can know almost everything about you with a relatively high degree of confidence. They know where you live. They can figure out where you work. They can figure out potentially things like your sexual orientation. They can figure out, or at least have a high degree of accuracy in guessing what your interests are. They can figure out, or have a high degree of guessing what your religion is, what political beliefs you support, and they can potentially figure out, or at least have a better than average chance of knowing whether or not you own a firearm. They can also potentially know if you've had an abortion. And it's worth noting that after the Dobbs decision, there was a lot of concern raised about the sensitivity of medical information that would be available under the Bank Secrecy Act in a state that prohibits or severely restricts abortion. And so I just really want to drive home the point that this is not a left or right thing or an R or D thing. This is a situation where everyone has sensitive information that is potentially accessible with basically no due process.
Dr. Peterson, why are you such a Luddite? Why don't you embrace artificial intelligence and facial recognition and massive computer surveillance and cameras on every street corner so that we could all be safer?
Well, because there's tremendous danger and too much security. If the emerging collusion between government and corporation, gigantic corporation, continues in the manner that it is continuing, there won't be anything that you do that can't be used against you and will be used against you in very short order. And the concerns that are expressed here about the local consequences of that, let's say with regards to January 6th, seem to me to fail to take into account the much broader threat that lurks underneath that everyone should be attending to. We're in danger of eliminating the private sphere entirely. That's already happening in places around the world, particularly in China, which is why I made reference to that. That technology is at hand. And it appears as though both giant governments and giant corporations are utilizing it in every way that they can manage. And it's often motivated by the claim that that's forestalling an immediate proximal threat, right? Well, that's a short-term justification for engaging in a tremendous long-term danger. And it should be perceived as dangerous to those on the left who are politically committed, because it will be the politically committed who are first identified by such systems.
Is it true that you have a PhD?
Yes.
Well, then why did Canada decide that you needed more education? Can you tell us about that?
Well, one reason, the entire transcript of an interview that I did with Joe Rogan was submitted as evidence with regards to the unacceptability of my views. What I was doing primarily in that interview that was criticized was questioning the validity of the economic models of economic collapse that were stacked upon the unstable models detailing out climate change 100 years into the future. That was deemed in Canada sufficient to proceed with complaints against me with regards to my professional competence to serve as a licensed psychologist. That was only one of many anonymous complaints that were fostered directly in relation to my political views.
Well, I thank you for showing up today. I think they may use your testimony as evidence that your re-education has not been successful.